Good morning and welcome to APAC's Legislative Leadership Summit. I'm Marilyn Milka, President and CEO of APAC's, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Founded 26 years ago by former Secretary Norman Y. Mineta, APAC's mission is to increase Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander representation at all levels of the political process. The Legislative Leadership Summit brings together nonprofit and corporate leaders, subject matter experts, as well as local and federally elected officials for a day of policy discussions that affect the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. We hope that this summit will raise awareness on issues that impact the AA and HPI community and help to inspire all of us to build more policies that will benefit all of our communities. I'd like to thank our many partners who have helped to make this event possible. Please be sure to visit their exhibitor booths and the good work they're doing by downloading the program book from the APAC's website. It is now my honor to introduce United States Senator Tammy Duckworth. Currently, she is the junior senator representing the state of Illinois. Prior to being an elected official, she was an Iraq War veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, and was among the first Army women to fly combat missions during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Senator Duckworth has been a consummate advocate of the ANHPI community and is also a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, also known as CAPAC. We are thrilled to have her join us today, so please welcome Senator Tammy Duckworth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in your Leadership Summit. It's an honor to be here, celebrating the strength and resilience of our community after this very difficult and heart-wrenching past year. A year that has shown us just how important it is to elevate AAPI voices and perspectives. I applaud APAC for its incredible work to achieve this goal, including helping to foster our next generation of AAPI leaders. The American story as we know it would not exist if it were not for this strength, the sweat of the AAPI community. In a very literal sense, Asian Americans helped connect this country, building the railroads from east to west. We laid the tracks, tilled the fields, started the businesses, and picked up the rifles necessary to develop and defend this great nation that we all love. Day after day, we help to prove that America's greatest asset is the diversity of her people. And yes, we've had moments when bigotry has prevailed, when prejudice marred our country's darkest days and toughest fights. Just within this past year, families have had rocks thrown at them, nurses have been spit on, heroes, frontline workers, hospital staff have been blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. Denied service, they've been treated as other than, as less than, simply because they are members of the AAPI community. My own mother, who's about to turn 80, was hassled and harassed in the middle of the produce aisle by a grocery store employee recently. Finally, she had to just say, "Look, please, leave me alone. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to buy grapes for my daughter's lunch." This is a woman who is married to an American veteran, who has 2 children who are American veterans, and one of whom is a United States Senator. But none of that mattered to that grocery store clerk. All that mattered was the color of her skin and the way she looked, because hate is relentless. It doesn't stop. It doesn't follow rhyme or reason. So now it is on all of us to attend and send the message that standing up for what's right is not a partisan matter. It's an American obligation. Time after time in our nation's history, we've refused to give up to the darkness of bigotry and discrimination. And we must refuse once again to let hate win. The miracle of America is that when it looks like those worst instincts are set to prevail, we come together and resist them. So now we must both honor how far we've come and recognize the work left to be done to achieve our nation's founding ideals of equality and justice for all. Events like tonight's and groups like APAC's move us one step closer to that better, more equal future. So thank you all for all that you do, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Be well.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth, for such moving remarks. It's now my pleasure to introduce Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus Chair and APAC's board member, Congresswoman Judy Chu, who will be delivering opening remarks. Congresswoman Chu represents California's 27th district and is the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress. Please welcome Congresswoman Chu.
Hello, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, and as chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call KPAC, I want to thank APACS for hosting today's critical discussion on the importance of allyship and the power of diversity. This is a topic that truly speaks to me. The only reason I was able to get elected to my first city council office was that I was able to build coalitions and bring people together in my city of Monterey Park, California. And so as KPAC chair, it's been a priority of mine to work closely with the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, or what we call the Tri-Caucus, to ensure that the needs and concerns of communities of color are front and center in our work in Congress. Collectively, the Tri-Caucus accounts for over half of the House Democratic Caucus, the majority. So together, we have a powerful coalition to be a strong voice for communities of color across our nation. And let me just say this coalition has never been more important than during this period. We were able to combat the Trump administration's effort to pit communities of color against each other and divide and weaken us by embracing the idea that when we work together as a majority, we have a loud voice. And we've used that voice to fight for important priorities for our communities, from addressing COVID-19 health and economic disparities to pushing for voting rights legislation and immigration reform. This unity is particularly important now as the country grapples with systemic racism and rising hate crimes. We know that violence against one community can quickly spread to other communities, and that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That is why, when the murder of George Floyd created shockwaves across the country, KPAC stood with the Black Caucus to condemn police brutality and pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. And as anti-Asian hate crimes began to rise, it was leaders from the Tri-Caucus who rushed to stand with KPAC in calling attention to the problem. And because we were joined by so many leaders, it helped more people to be aware of the problem and encouraged more people to speak out on how to stop anti-Asian hate and to get the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act across the finish line. I have one final example why allyship matters, and that is the passage of my No Ban Act to repeal Donald Trump's cruel and discriminatory Muslim bans and to make sure they never happen again. I could not do it alone, which is why I was thrilled to be joined not just by fellow AAPI and Muslim groups, but also Jewish, Christian, Black, Hispanic, and white leaders as well. And because we built such a broad coalition of support, the No Ban Act became the first ever Muslim civil rights bill passed by Congress. That could not have happened without the coalition of support we built, and that coalition would not have been possible without building these alliances in the first place. It is my hope that in building diverse coalitions and showing up for one another, we can build a more inclusive America where everyone feels safe and welcome. So thank you again for all that you're doing to build strong allyships that empower us all.
Thank you, Congresswoman Chu, for your leadership. It's now my pleasure to introduce fellow KPAC member, Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, who is also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congresswoman Strickland represents Washington's 10th Congressional District. She is the first African American to represent Washington State at the federal level and one of the first Korean American women elected to Congress. We're excited to have her join us this morning. Please welcome Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland.
This is U.S. Representative Marilyn Strickland, proudly representing the 10th Congressional District of Washington State, and I'm proud to be here today to talk about allyship and the power of diverse voices. I'm a proud member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I'm here today to show that we stand with you and that we are here to support you in the journey that we all are taking together for racial justice, for economic opportunity, to stop hate crimes, and really looking at how we can empower each other. I'm a member of both the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Asia Pacific American Caucus. And as I come here today to talk about solidarity, I want to make sure that we remember a few things. Historically, there has been a practice of trying to divide our communities, but now we have moments to stand together, whether it's standing in solidarity for Black Lives Matter, standing in solidarity to stop Asian hate, but also standing in solidarity to make sure that we have immigration policies that work for all of us, and that all of us get to live with the expectation that this country, the United States of America, belongs to each and every one of us. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We know that allyship matters so much, but when we're able to come together as a tri-caucus, as African Americans, as Asia Pacific Islanders, as Latinos, we have an opportunity to use our strength, to use our solidarity, and address some of the biggest issues that we face. Again, economic opportunity, fairness, racial justice, and ensuring that this country works for all of us, and we're living up to its promise. Thank you for the chance to be here today.
Thank you, Congresswoman Strickland, for your moving remarks. I'd like to now invite the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Congressman Raul Ruiz, for opening remarks. Congressman Ruiz represents California's 36th congressional district, and prior to being elected to Congress, he was an emergency room doctor where he had obvious direct experience with healthcare. Please welcome Congressman Raul Ruiz.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Congressman Dr. Raul Ruiz. I represent California's 36th congressional district in Southern California. I'm an emergency medicine physician and a public health expert with training in humanitarian and disaster aid. I'm also chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. It is a pleasure to be with you at the 2021 Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies Legislative Summit to discuss allyship, the key to unlocking the power of diversity. Thank you to the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies for your leadership and work in actively promoting Asian Pacific American participation and representation at all levels of the political process, from community service to elected office. As the first Hispanic physician to serve in Congress, I understand the importance of diversity in representation and the value of having different perspectives at the decision-making table. Our diversity is our strength. The latest 2020 census data shows that our nation is diversifying faster than predicted. Most noteworthy is the increased diversity in the younger population. In 2019, for the first time, more than half of the nation's population under age 16 identified as a racial or ethnic minority. As our nation becomes more diverse, we must give more attention to the needs of and opportunities for our country's highly diverse younger generations. This will be necessary to ensure their and our nation's success. This year, CAC has already made efforts to increase diversity in the workplace, both in the public and private sectors. CHC has been actively working with PPO to ensure the Biden administration prioritizes diversity across all departments and agencies. In the past few months, we have also met with multiple large media companies to discuss diversity and representation in the workplace, especially in publishing, journalism, and TV. As communities of colors, we have a duty to work with one another to build allyship and solidarity. Allyship is a strategic mechanism our communities can use to fight injustice and promote equity through advocacy, policies, practice, and culture. The Tri-Caucus, which is made up of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, has collaborated on several issues this Congress. We are actively working together to increase diversity in the Biden administration, address vaccine equity, pass the U.S. Citizenship Act to provide a pathway to citizenship for millions of people in our country, and to combat domestic terrorism and white supremacy. The recent rise in hate crimes targeting the Asian American and Asian immigrant communities is both reprehensible and contrary to our deepest values of justice. We must stop this hate. My colleagues and I in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus proudly stand in solidarity with the AAPI community in the fight against hate crimes. Just a few weeks ago, the Senate passed legislation designed to strengthen federal efforts to address hate crimes against Asian Americans. I am proud to say that all 4 senators of the CAC voted in favor of the bill. I too look forward to supporting its passage in the House later this month. The CHC is committed to eliminating the barriers and systemic inequalities minorities communities face and delivering progress for our communities. We look forward to continuing to work with our colleagues in Congress, as well as President Biden and Vice President Harris, to build a better tomorrow. So thank you. Thank you for having me today, and thank you to the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies for strengthening and empowering Asian Pacific American communities and developing leadership, building public policy knowledge, and filling the political pipeline for Asian Pacific Americans to pursue public office at the local, state, and federal levels. Together, we can advance public policy that creates lasting changes to ensure the promise of America is accessible to the communities of color living across our great nation. Our diversity is our strength, and our unity is our power. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Ruiz, for your leadership. It's much appreciated. I would now like to invite Congressman Jimmy Gomez for remarks. Congressman Gomez represents California's 34th Congressional District, one of the most diverse districts in the country, that has one of a large Koreatowns in Los Angeles. Congressman Gomez is also a huge ally on issues for our community, as he serves as a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, otherwise known as CAPAC. Please welcome Congressman Jimmy Gomez.
Welcome to the APAC's Legislative Leadership Summit on Allyship. I'm Congressman Jimmy Gomez, and I represent one of the most diverse congressional districts in the entire nation. I represent communities from Koreatown, Little Tokyo, Chinatown, historic Filipino town, as well as various Mexican-American and Latin American communities. And one of the things that I'm constantly reminded of is that there's more that unites us than divides us. One of the things that people tend to forget is that our parents came here either recently or generations ago to give every single one of us a chance at the American dream. That is something that has occurred over and over and over again. And also, people try to forget that the Asian community and the Latino community have fought hand in hand for civil rights and workers' rights. Larry Itlon, with the farm workers, the Filipino farm workers movement, joined Cesar Chavez, started the Delano grape strikes, and changed history in California forever. So I want to just say that during these kind of times that we're living in today, where we see Asian hate crimes committed against our brothers and sisters, that it is up to every single one of us to step up and speak out, to defend, and also to make sure that anybody that does that is brought to justice. So let's continue this allyship, but let's be there on every single issue. When it comes to healthcare, immigration, education, when it comes to a variety of issues that impact our communities directly, let's be there for one another. And let's do that through public policy and politics, because I know that's how our communities get stronger. This is something that we should do not just when there's a flare-up of Asian hate or a flare-up of anti-immigrant hate that's directed at Latinos. We need to do that every single day, from the boardrooms to the campaign offices to the halls of Congress. We got to be there. So I'm proud that we're moving in a more just direction, but it's going to take time, and it's going to be those old histories that bring us together, that make sure that people understand that no matter what you look like, no matter what country you come from, no matter what language your parents spoke, no matter the God you worship, that you have a place here in the United States of America.
Thank you, Congressman Gomez, for all of your support. We greatly appreciate it. I would now like to invite APEC's board member, Krish Gupta, with a special message from Dell Technologies. Let's welcome Krish Gupta.
Dell Technologies is proud to sponsor the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. For over a decade, Dell has partnered with APEX to support and celebrate the rich history and legacy of the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. During this historic time in our country, we're reminded of the impact that hate and discrimination have on minority communities. But we're also reminded of the strength we have when we come together to advocate for what's right and the change that we can affect when we stand together in unity. Now, more than ever, it's important to stand in solidarity with these communities and partner with organizations like Apex that are working to create more opportunities for diverse populations, increase representation, and share common goals and values around diversity, equity, and inclusion. At Dell Technologies, we see diversity and inclusion as a business imperative. We know that a diverse workforce supported by an inclusive culture delivers business and social value that is just as important as the technology and services we provide. Creating a diverse and inclusive culture is key to our success now and in the future. Dell's diversity and inclusion strategy encourages positive change by empowering team members to be their true self, creating a culture where all team members belong, and encouraging innovation in new ways. One of the best examples of how we are empowering our diverse team members is our network of employee resource groups, or ERGs. Our 13 ERGs positively affect employee satisfaction by allowing team members to lead, connect, and grow. They're a driving force for diversity and inclusion, uniting team members around gender, ethnicity, identity, and various backgrounds. Our Asians in Action ERG unites members to drive impact, develop careers, grow communities, and enhance connections, all through the Asian perspective. This year, they've been a driving force in bringing global awareness at Dell Technologies around acts of discrimination, racism, and hate crimes toward the AAPI community, establishing a standing in solidarity reflection that was attended by more than 1,300 team members around the world. They've also been critical at providing resources and identifying donation opportunities that would be matched dollar for dollar by Dell Technologies. At a time when these communities often felt alone in the fight, we've witnessed our ERGs uplifting and rallying alongside each other for change, for equality, and for justice. With our Black Networking Alliance ERG standing in solidarity to end violence against the AAPI community, and our Asians in Action ERG advocating for justice following George Floyd's murder. These are powerful reminders of the incredible support and change that we can have when we tackle issues with inclusivity and unity. At Dell Technologies, D&I efforts are not just limited to ERGs. The company has set aggressive goals around what we want to accomplish in the next decade, including increasing representation of women and underserved groups at all levels of the company, continuing to cascade our unconscious bias foundational learning from our leadership to all individual contributors globally, exposing younger generations to STEM careers and building our future talent pipeline, and many other goals. All of these goals have the support of our senior leadership because setting goals, measuring progress, and being transparent holds us accountable to be the business we strive to be. I encourage you to learn more about our 2030 goals at delltechnologies.com/social impact. Thank you to Apex for the continued partnership over the past decade. We're honored to be a part of this year's Legislative Leadership Summit. Please enjoy this important discussion about building allyship across communities of color.
Thank you, Krish, for your service on the Apex board and for your remarks and all your work. Before we start the first panel, I want to give context to this upcoming discussion. When Apex started its first policy summit in September of 2018, I wanted to highlight how APIs can be the convener in bringing forth the topic of allyship. It's something that we have consistently discussed in every legislative summit since we began this event in 2018. I raise it because it's such an important topic to see that our constituencies have always done the work to support one another without much fanfare, and it's the work that's being done together that APACS wants to uplift. So let's get started. I would like to invite our moderator for this panel, Stuart Ishimura. Stuart is a respected government servant who served over 3 decades in government in various roles in the legislative and executive branches. He last served within the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from 2012 until his retirement in 2018. So Stuart, take it away. Thanks so much.
Madeline, thanks so much for the invitation to come today. This is an exciting panel. We have a stellar group of people. I don't want to waste any more time, so let's jump right into it. Let me introduce our panelists. Becky Monroe is the Director of Fighting Hate and Bias Program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Clarissa Martinez de Castro is the Deputy Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Unidos US. Fawn Sharp is the President of the National Congress of American Indians. Juliet Choi is the President and CEO at the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. And Susie Feliz is the Vice President of Policy and Legislative Affairs at the National Urban League. So we'll have a discussion. Let me take the moderator's prerogative by telling you a little story. This is Heritage Month, and the best thing about it, in my mind, over the years is the ability to talk story like we do in Hawaii. And my story is that back in 1981, I just finished my first year of law school, and I had the privilege of working for the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, the federal commission that studied the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. And the commission did its work, held public hearings, took great care in compiling the story of Japanese Americans during World War II and their incarceration in internment camps around the country. In 1983, they came out with recommendations of what to do following this, which included an apology and reparations of $20,000 per person for people who were interned in the camps. This had to pass the Congress, and at the time I thought, well, good luck with that. This is a real pipe dream. Yet it was from allyship and finding allies, people who understood the issue, that back 5 years later, President Reagan was signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 into law. Truly an amazing experience, because frankly, there were not that many Japanese Americans, and certainly not that many surviving Japanese Americans, who would have been eligible for this. And it was from allyship and the chance to tell our story and a chance for others to join us in this fight that it taught me the importance of this. And certainly things have changed since the 80s. There has been the growth of the APA community, the creation of groups like Apex and others that bring in communities, both old and new, into the fold, and pulling in people from, around the country that make this worthwhile. So let's start our discussion. I'm going to call on panelists to answer the questions. I would ask panelists to make sure that you keep your answers relatively brief so we can have a discussion. And for people in the audience, let me encourage you to use the Q&A button to send us questions, and we will try to work those in following our discussion. So my first question is, how can communities of color build allyship and work together during these challenging times? Let me start with Becky.
Thank you. And really, thank you again for this opportunity. On behalf of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is a coalition of over 220 civil and human rights organizations, we welcome this opportunity. And in fact, our entire organization is premised on the idea that collaboration and that coalition work is essential to all of our civil rights. So one of the things I think that is really important to emphasize, and something we've been focused on, is that this idea that there is division and this determination to foster division among our communities that are targeted for hate is in fact one of the most pernicious effects of white supremacy. So I think that one of the things that is really important to note is, as Stuart was mentioning, allyship is not new, nor is, when we think about, for example, Frederick Douglass was denouncing the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This is not a new partnership between communities that have been targeted for hate. I also wanted to highlight a very specific example that we've seen in recent days. You've heard about the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. That act, of course, was brought because of the advocacy of Asian American Pacific Islander community organizations across the country, and thanks to people like Senator Hirono and Congresswoman Meng. One of the things that's really important about that act, it was because of the AAPI community that act was opened up to make sure it included provisions that would help all communities, that would make sure that all communities that are targeted for hate would have more access to better data and to better resources, and to including a provision that actually invests in communities. So one of the other things I think is really important to note, and that we are proud to do as the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, is to listen to communities who are targeted for hate. It was communities who were targeted for hate who said, we know, standing in solidarity, that what we need are investments in community organizations, investments in mental health, investments in social services, and that those investments must be across all communities that are targeted for hate. And so I think that is one very concrete example of how we can kind of blow up this myth of, all of our communities are divided. In fact, as we heard earlier from the members of Congress, our unity is our strength, and we have seen time and time again Asian American community, African American community, the Latino community come together to combat hate together. So thank you again for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. Susie, let's turn to you. Why don't we do this? We're having problems hearing Susie. And why don't we go to Clarissa next while we fix Susie's audio issue. Clarissa, please.
Can you hear me now? I think I might have.
It came in and out, Susie. It came in and out. So why don't we go to Clarissa and we'll try to fix that while we're off camera. Clarissa, please.
Thank you. And yes, I hope Susie can come back. I know we all want to hear her wisdom on this. First of all, thanks for inviting me. And I think apropos of this question, right? The fact that the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies is having this conversation as part of its legislative summit is one of the key words that for me answers this question in how we build allyship and work together. And that word is action. Within our own communities, we have to understand our own histories, the contributions we have made, whose shoulders we're building on, and also, obviously, and more so now, grapple with our own understanding of colorism and bias, which are part of the architecture of racism. And also acknowledge that we're not starting from scratch. As Marilyn mentioned, many in our communities, among our organizations, have worked together for years. And undeniably, we are in a moment of great challenge, but also of great opportunity to intensify and expand those partnerships. I believe that doing so will fully unleash the superpower that each of our communities can bring to the effort to combine, move the nation forward in a more inclusive way. And each of us individually, as well as organizationally, at times we may be atoning, at times we will be allies, at times partners, and at times leaders, but always actors, because we all have a role to play. The preamble of the Constitution starts with "we the people" in order to form a more perfect union. So that signals that we are a work in progress, and that all Americans, including the person staring back at you in the mirror, has a role to play. For example, in terms of unleashing each of our community's superpowers so that together we can push forward, I think that Latinos can be natural bridge builders because we are multiracial, we are multi-denominational, we can be Asian, Black, Indigenous, white. And so therefore, unleashing our superpower could be doing those steps and really bringing that to the effort. We also encompass many who have experienced bias, discrimination, and racism in different ways, depending on our immigration status sometimes depending on the size of our wallets or where we fall in the color spectrum. So I think that's how we work together, through action, understanding our own histories, understanding others' histories and our shared history, so we can bring that to the fight together.
Clarissa, thank you. Let's try going back to Susie. Hopefully her mic's working, and we'll give it a shot. Susie?
Okay. Well, hopefully you hear me better now. I just wanted to underscore what my colleagues have already said, but one word that comes to mind is intentionality. And by that I mean, given the fact that there are the triple pandemics of the COVID-19 virus, the economic recession, and racism, I think we have a real opportunity to be intentional in finding ways to advance policy solutions that can help create meaningful and lasting change in our communities. Just as an example, the National Urban League, and I don't know if you caught that introduction, but we're a national civil rights organization dedicated to economic empowerment of African Americans and other underserved communities. And we've had this mission since 1910. We also operate through a national local affiliate network of 90 affiliates across 36 states in the District of Columbia. Well, I just wanted to say that as an example, we worked in coalition with many of our brother and sister organizations in the Latinx, the African American, and the AAPI community to advance important COVID relief and recovery provisions, whether it was ensuring our small businesses had stay afloat, or that renters and homeowners still stay in their homes, or we provided some employment assistance to those who lost jobs through no fault of their own. We worked together to advance those common solutions, and we were able to win. And so, you know, I know that we've got others that are also going to speak on this topic, but I think that the word again that stands out is just being intentional in our motives, being intentional in our action. And we can see, at least from the past year, that our work together will yield results and change for our communities.
Susie, thank you. Intentionality is important, and hopefully we'll talk about that a bit more. Let me go next to Fawn, please. I think we're having problems with Fawn's audio, so let's try to fix that. Is Fawn unmuted? Want to try one more time?
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invite, and hopefully this sound will remain connected. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for the invite and the opportunity to join so many amazing colleagues. My advice and recommendations on this question is that we all recognize that this world in this country has had a long history of division, of hatred, and of racism. And generation after generation, our ancestors have dealt with this dark division. That's a reality within this country. And every generation has a choice. And that choice is to simply rise above all of the hatred that we see all around us. Rise above it to that place where we know the laws of nature and the basic human and civil rights that we all possess are an attribute of who we are. They're inherent. Nobody can take those rights and freedoms away from us. We just have to live in them every single day. And when we can rise above all of that and come together and emulate within our own communities what it means to be respectful of one another, what it means to live in that way, to govern that way, and to ally in that way, we can show by a very powerful example those basic foundational principles upon which this country was built. Because quite frankly, from our experience, from the signing of the very first treaties, we found promises were broken, and there were issues of trust generation after generation for centuries. And with each generation, we can choose to be part of the problem or choose to rise above it, to be part of the solution, and treat everyone equally, treat everyone fairly and with respect and honor. And when we can do that collectively as a people and recognize that while we've faced institutional racism and racism at every level, there's power in each one of our communities and each narrative. And when we can harness that strength that is born generation after generation and bring our narratives together and collectively recognize and appreciate within each and every community that we do have a powerful narrative. We do have a powerful story of resistance, of perseverance, of embracing those values that we all share. And it is through that type of leadership that our communities have not only been able to survive, but thrive and become more and more resilient. Because while we have multi-generational conflict and adversary, we have multi-generational strength. And we all stand on a legacy of leaders that have gone before us, that have confronted the issues of their time, and they've confronted it in ways that do demonstrate not only to those in this country, but to those around the world who are watching what's happening within the United States. And I think 2020 presented a very shocking and rude awakening to many people, not only in this country, but around the world, that the civil rights era and movement of the 1960s did not rid this country of racism. We've all known that while that was a very powerful movement a generation ago, that racism and that conflict has always been there, and we've felt it day in and day out. And so for our friends and allies, not only within our communities, but in the larger community, we now have that opportunity to reconcile those basic foundational principles, rise above the conflict, and demonstrate by example what it means to live with honor, dignity, and respect. Well.
Fawn, thank you. Very, very powerful. Let me go to Juliet next. Juliet, please.
Great. I want to make sure folks can hear me okay. Yeah, okay, great. I got the thumbs up. Well, I just have to thank Madeline and Apex for bringing us together, and Stuart with so much respect and deference. I think you asked us to talk about how we build allyship, and candidly, with a lot of my colleagues here on the call, we were reminiscing just a few moments before that the fact that connected actually not anything allies. Do that, and where are we now? We are the oldest and largest health justice advocacy organization, fighting for the health and wellness for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities. And depending which way you look at it, we're 35 years old or 35 years young. But this moment in time, and together with our partners in our conversation today, and thinking about everybody that's joining us virtually, I just want to underscore that we have always had the power within our individual and collective communities to drive that community narrative. And so absolutely, in a racial equity conversation and a civil rights, human rights dialogue, there's always so much more to do. But I also want to celebrate and amplify for those who are tuning in, who may not, be part of our Washington, D.C. Incite the Beltway conversations, but for all of you who are joining our dialogue from across the country. We have always had such a strong dialogue, a community narrative of who we are individually, and we have always, through the decades, literally the decades, to find a way where we support one another. Of course, within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, with the COVID global pandemic, I can share with you, I never imagined and could have anticipated over the last 15 months. While we understand the power of words, I actually personally and professionally never anticipated how those hateful words from the highest ranking corners of American democracy over the last 4 years would have seeded a new, different opportunity of hate. But that said, I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on the vibrancy, the resiliency, and the strength of our collective communities of color, and our allies who have always been there. And I think, if anything, at this moment in time, over the last many months, but here as we celebrate AA and HPI Heritage Month, I think this is a doubling down, a clarion call for all of us, not just for AA and HPI Heritage Month, but for all of us to step forward as Americans, as a patriotic duty, as a patriotic part of our DNA as all Americans, to say, absolutely, when it comes to hate, no matter our shade of color, no matter our background or socioeconomic background, we will absolutely denounce xenophobia and hate. Because Americans, and as patriots, whether you're first generation or 10th generation, this is intrinsically an American value. And that's how I want to talk about today in terms of amplification of allyship. I will say we've talked about, I think, at the national and federal level, we are welcoming, we are working through, journeying through a new White House. We are welcoming the Biden and Harris administration. But if I can take one more moment and just take it back to our neighborhoods, our communities, our families, our colleagues, really, really at that local level. This is all about civic engagement. So yes, we talk about elections at the national level, but I want to ask each and every one of us, we have friends, we have family members who are prime, who are wise, who have something to offer in the civic engagement process. So think about running for your local city council. Think about running for your local board of education or your school board. whether you are first generation American or 10th generation American. This is the experiment. This is the vibrancy of the American democratic experience. And so all of us, no matter what shade we are, we should and absolutely must and see ourselves in that American democratic process. The fact that all of us here on today's call and the members of Congress who joined us before our dialogue were so willing and wanting to join us, that is just another expression of this wonderful American democratic exercise. And I very, very firmly believe that each and every one of us, we've got that fire in the belly. We have something to contribute. And so when we talk about allyship, of course, it is not about highlighting what divides our society, but it is finding our commonality. And I think earlier on in today's dialogue, many of us and others have highlighted those words expressed by Dr. Martin Luther King, where he stated, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I know that is seared in our hearts and minds. And I am also, that is that clarion call to bring the strength of our immigrant communities, our minority communities, our rural communities, but all of our allies, no matter what shade, to this notion of building a better democratic society. And I think we all know the world absolutely is watching. But at that said, I think it's really important for us collectively to reach out and talk with our families and our neighbors to bring this dialogue back down to that community level, so that collectively, again, once more, we can amplify the strength and the vibrancy, the beauty and the resiliency of the mosaic that is our American society.
Juliet, thank you. That was terrific. Let me go on to my second question. Question of how do we get folks to talk about problems in other communities? Everybody has a lot of issues on their plate, but how do we get people and various communities to care for each other and think about other communities and the problems they're having? Let me start with Fawn.
Yes. Silkwell, thank you for that question. My suggestion in how we begin to talk to each other is, with every one of the issues that confront our respective communities, I think we must be bold, I think we must be courageous, and I think we must be unapologetic. I think we all have a very clear vision, a collective vision of what a fair, just, and equitable world looks like. And for us, I think to the second point of your question, I think it's very important for each and every one of us, as we communicate with each other, to put down our own lens and our own perspective when it comes to talking with our equity partners. And we must work with intention to see their history, their challenge, and their vision from their perspective and from their lens and from their values, and then work together to support each other in not only understanding our history and learning each and every community's history, but also come together in a way that we know that we have a collective vision on how we reconcile this country back to its foundational principles, because we all see it day in, day out that this country is unhinged from those basic foundational principles. But when we can act boldly, courageously, and unapologetically to those fundamental principles that transcend national borders, that transcend communities, and as I said earlier, rise above that to live in that space where we can speak boldly and truthfully to bring our communities together. From my perspective, I think there's tremendous power in that. And there's tremendous power when we can come together. And there's no question in my mind that each and every one of our communities have that common ground of what a fair, just, and equitable world looks like. And we're all willing to provide the work and to provide the active listening and to be humble enough to set aside our own views and respectful enough to see it from our equity partners' perspective and lens, and to support them on their path and their journey toward a better and just world.
Great, Fawn. Thank you. Becky?
I think building off of what Fawn said, one of the things that's really critical is confronting our ongoing history of racism and white supremacy in this country. As Fawn mentioned, it doesn't mean that we do not all have this very common and shared aspiration to live up to our founding ideals, but we cannot do that if we do not acknowledge and directly confront our shared history. So I think one really concrete example of that is, Fawn was mentioning sort of if you look at our history, none of this is new. So one of the things that we, on January 6th, I think one of the things that was really painful about the insurrection for many communities targeted for hate was that there were some people, mainly white people, who said, oh my goodness, I can't believe this violent white nationalism is such a problem in this country. That was deeply insulting and harmful for communities that have been targeted for violent white nationalist activity for generations. So one of the things we've seen is that communities have come together and recognized, because of this history, again, this history does not mean we cannot work together to become stronger, but because of this shared history, we need to learn from what has happened. So when we talk about now what groups are coming together to fight for, to combat violent white nationalism, when we are looking at things, when we're hearing from Asian American advocates who are in the streets demanding more investments in communities, those are the same calls we're hearing from people who are demanding justice for African Americans and for other communities. We are seeing a call to remember, there's sometimes a rush, for example, to create a new charge. So there's been a call for a new domestic terrorism charge. One of the things that we've heard time and time again is that there should be no cover for the failure to address violent white nationalism in this country. We have had the tools, we just have not had the will to use them. We look at things like COINTELPRO. So for example, the program in which a national security lens was applied and that African American leaders, including Dr. King, were targeted by saying that they were sort of a threat to national security. So one of the problems we've seen is that, sometimes there are new policy ideas that if we were living in a world where we didn't have the kind of systemic racism that has infected a lot of our institutions, we could embrace them. But what we have done time and time again is listen and learn from our collective experiences to recognize that it really is true that our collective civil rights and our collective freedoms really are bound up in each other. So that we know that when there are programs, for example, another thing that we've heard a lot about is sort of the importance of confronting our history. Another example is looking at reparations for African Americans. As Stuart mentioned, when we look at the redress movement, Japanese Americans, and looking at reparations there, one of the groups that has been the loudest supporter for reparations for African Americans is the Japanese American Citizens League. There is a recognition that these issues are deeply interrelated, and that if we do not address racism and hatred targeting the Asian American community, we will continue to see racism and hatred targeting all of our communities. So I think that one of the most important ways is, again, being really honest, confronting our history, looking at ways in which we can come together to say that the very same people who could have given up on our country generations ago, Black and brown leaders, Asian leaders who have said, no, our country can and must be better than this, Native American leaders who had ample grounds to give up, do not. And I think, as we've heard from time and time again, that is the strength of our country. And so we must continue to follow that lead. And I think that is where we recognize that we are deeply bound up in each other's civil rights protections.
Becky, thank you. The commonality piece is really important, and thank you for raising that. Juliet, any thoughts?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's typically hard to follow Becky and her words of wisdom. But I know in some shared conversations with colleagues, I just want to say, going back to your question, how do we get folks to talk about the problems in other communities and how can we care for each other? I would say, again, just can we agree on some shared values and principles, that this is not a zero-sum game of a dialogue, that we all share a common humanity, and at the same time, with the diversity of all of our communities, I think it's equally important to create that space where we can step forward openly and curiosity is embraced to share, you know what, we want to get to know all of our communities and the diversity and vibrancy of what our individual communities represent. I know legislatively, you know, between Congresswoman Grace Meng and other legislative leaders, there have been several attempts of creating educational curriculum that will reform the education for our next young generation to include more vibrancy of the whole of our American history. So I do go back and say, like, let's create that space and that grid for one another where, you know, we may not know fully about each one another's history, but where we can encourage curiosity and create space for dialogue, I think is incredibly important. I also do think, just to highlight the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, if I can just sort of extrapolate a couple narratives there and how we take care of one another. We know this is not a numbers game. For the AA-NHPI communities, on one hand, you know, some demographic reports will state that we're the fastest growing ethnic population in the U.S. But quantitatively, we will never, you know, amount to like the millions and millions of Americans, you know, compared to our other diverse communities. But that said, this is where I go back to. It's not a zero-sum game. I think we need to understand, have a willingness and a curiosity, to have the resiliency as an American society to state, you know a little bit about one another's community, but I want to know more and I need to know more. I do think it's that education and information is what is going to dispel those myths, whether it's like the Asian American minority myth or this notion of our communities being that perpetual foreigner. So I do think that education component, and from local to federal to the White House, creating the spaces for safe and shared dialogue is what allow us to genuinely care for one another. Again, I underscore that neighbor to neighbor approach.
Juliet, thank you. Susie, the National Urban League is one of the oldest and largest civil rights organizations out there. How does the National Urban League think about other communities and thinking about their stories as well?
Well, thank you, Stuart. The National Urban League and through our leadership have been, and I'm going to use the word again, very intentional about our approach to partnering with and building coalitions with multicultural organizations and civil rights groups that represent other communities. One thing that just comes to mind is the opportunities that we've taken to maximize the power of social media, particularly in this virtual environment, to hold space with communities that are different from our own, to allow members of our brother and sister organizations and community members to validate their suffering or to dialogue about our collective experiences. Just as an example, in light of last month's horrific anti-Asian attacks in Georgia, and the uptick in hate crimes against Asian Americans over the last year, the National Urban League held a conversation on Facebook Live with AAJC President John Yang and Representative Judy Chu, who we just heard from, who's the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. This gave us the opportunity to openly discuss the root causes of the attacks, the impacts on our on Asian API communities, and possible courses of action for accountability and justice. So this new virtual environment that we're in really does make it easier to convene voices from across the country and around the globe to speak out against injustice and hate. And we've been doing more of that. But I also mentioned, on a policy level, we've been working behind the scenes with multicultural advocacy organizations to identify policy solutions that address shared problems. And we've been working together to advocate on Capitol Hill and with the administration to advance equity and justice for all of our communities.
Susie, thank you. Clarissa, let me turn to you. Any thoughts?
Well, I think that we've covered a lot of ground. As my fellow panelists have said, it's a progression. At its core is building relationships and also exercising the agency we individually or organizationally may have where we have it, to build, hold, and expand space and build power. In that way, to model the behavior we want to see. We've talked a great deal about how if you turn on the news, it looks like we're broken beyond repair as a society, even though the majority of Americans continue to see the diversity of our country as a strength that we should protect. But you look at the news or you look at social media, you don't see that. And so modeling that behavior, I think, is an important part of continuing to try to shape the narrative. Building space means within our organizations and circles, inviting the voices of those whose challenges we're seeking to learn more about and partner with. Holding space means willing to listen and help people be listened to, and vice versa. And expanding space, that means that in circles where we have agency, if there are issues being discussed where we see that there are voices missing, is to exercise our voice, to have those voices, those other voices invited in. I'll give you a very tiny example just to show you that we have agency in different ways, small and bigger. Unidos has been involved in an election e-poll for over 10 years. This really came about from having a real need to ensure that there was an accurate picture about the aspirations and needs of the Hispanic electorate. And that project expanded into the American Election Eve poll. So as that was happening, we asked that the American Indian Alaska Native community be included so that it could be the American Election Eve project. And that it be included not just in terms of who was being sampled and responding to the poll, but that it be included in terms of helping design the questionnaire and helping present the findings. It also, as our colleagues from the National Urban League and others have talked about, is that through the work that we have done together as part of the Racial Equity Anchor Collaborative of Building Relationships, we have tried to bring our networks together in different states to collaborate, certainly on the census, on electoral participation. And that serves a dual purpose. There's common purpose in both of those things, getting counted in the census, making sure that our communities are being heard in the ballot box, but also it creates vehicles for people to work together and to come together to solve issues facing their communities, which I think it's one of the critical things, is how do we move to action and give people on-ramps to work together? As many have said, we have a clear opportunity right now, whether it is this administration who has articulated that they want to lead with a lens of racial equity, coming together to shape how is it that they're going to do that and do it in a meaningful way, the same way that we worked together over the last year as we saw relief package after relief package that excluded millions of people in our communities to advocate legislation that would start undoing those wrongs. And we finally saw some of that progress come to fruition at the end of the year, and certainly with the American Rescue Plan. That is the result of communities working together.
Great, thank you. Like any good panel, we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask sort of a compound question, and you can pick and choose what you want to do, and then we'll go to closing statements. First, how can we have an ongoing conversation about government policies that lead to systemic racism? And also, how can we address the false narrative that communities of color can't work together? Can't we model what it's like to stand together and act together? I'll throw that out there and see where people go, but we have about 15 minutes left. It's actually fairly quick. So let's start with Becky and go down the list.
Sure. I think I wanted to give one example of how we can both demonstrate and we have seen time and time again from local organizations work together to make sure that we are actually working together in coalition. I mentioned earlier that we saw really historic vote a couple of weeks ago, thanks to the leadership of people like Congressman, Senator Raul, as well as Congressman Chu, with the passage of the COVID-19 Act. And what I want to talk about is what was included in that. So I mentioned that part of what API community talks on through labor and handling, or giving feedback. Is that better? Feedback-wise? Well, hear me? You can understand me. Okay. I will maybe let. Can you still hear me? No.
What? Why don't we go to Juliet quickly, and let's see if we can fix that. Juliet, for a quick answer to these sort of long-winded questions.
Sure. I mean, quick responses, and I'm hopeful Becky can come back online. I'm interested to hear from our fellow colleagues. This notion of a false narrative, we have wonderful narratives within our community, and I actually want to try to find a way to uplift the wonderful narratives. I do think that, so number one, we have wonderful narratives within our communities. So with our audience and our partners, let's double down and amplify that. Number two, this notion of, maybe it's an outdated phrase, of false wedge politics. And I think that's something not to dismiss. And the false wedge politics, as amplification and illustration of this dialogue, these partners here, and Clarissa had, highlighted, they're the racial equity anchors, our coalition that has been in existence for over a decade in partnership with the Kellogg Foundation. And Becky represents the Leadership Conference, which is a coalition of over 200 organizations. So this notion of false narratives, we have the power and the tools to squash this, period. And I am just really, really eager for us who are dialing in locally and nationally. Let's just quash this. Let's amplify our community narrative and not play this defensive notion of false narratives, wedge politics that gets created by others.
Juliet, thank you. Let's go back to Becky. Hopefully she's working. And again, we got to make this fairly quick so we can squeeze everyone in. Becky? It's not working, I don't think. So I'm going to go to Susie. And if you have some thoughts on this, we'll try to fix Becky's mic. Susie?
Sure. I think that in order to have ongoing conversations about government policies that may lead to systemic racism, it's important to acknowledge the past so that we don't repeat it. And I think that starts in our nation's schools, where our children need to know the full impact of government policies on our communities. Many federal policies have led to the wholesale economic disenfranchisement of our communities, yet those policies are mostly just a footnote in our children's history books. So I think that, you know, for instance, redlining. I've learned more about redlining in my advocacy with the National Urban League than at any point during my formal education. And yet, you know, it's been such a big factor in creating the generational wealth divide that we see today. So we need to start teaching our young people the truth. And then as we create new policies, I also believe it's important that we include guardrails to make sure they do no harm in communities of color. And it's also important to promote transparency through data disaggregation by race and ethnicity. That's one way to find out the impact on our communities. But I mean, at the end of the day, one of the ways that, at least the lenses that the National Urban League uses when we review policy and we're creating new or helping to create new legislation, is, you know, how is it going to impact the communities that need it the most, or conversely, how do we ensure that we don't create an unintended consequence in our communities?
Susie, thank you. Clarissa?
Wow, yes, indeed, we're running out of time, but I am very mindful that this is a legislative summit, so there are plenty of things to do there to ensure that we keep pushing this forward in terms of the actions that government takes. We talked about the White House for the first time saying they want to lead with racial equity and setting up a task force to do so. Some of us have been pushing together, and the more the better, to ensure that they indeed implement policies and procedures that seek to erase what is happening in our communities and embraces accurate data collection, which can in turn drive effective policies and evaluation of the policies that are currently in place. I think we've all been hearing what's going on in terms of the next process of redistricting. And we know from past experience that there are efforts to pit our communities against each other in a way that actually we all lose. So starting to work now to build a common narrative and a common collaboration to prevent that from happening, which also extends to the right to vote. There is legislation before Congress to protect the right to vote. Let's work in whatever way we can to make that a reality. And at the same time, we know that there are numerous bills to try to shut down the voices of our communities at the state level. So let's work together in the different places where we may have agency to prevent that. In terms of the overall narrative, I just leave you with the thing that when I get down gives me hope. And that is that even in the midst of one of the most rhetorically divisive periods we've seen, a majority of Americans still believe that diversity makes us stronger. So how we come together and model the behavior we want to see and give people agency, creating on-ramps, however small, so that people feel that they can do something about this is key.
Clarissa, thank you. Let me go to closing statements, and I can give each person about a minute or so. So let me start with Fawn, and I'll work my way down. Fawn, please. Let me try.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go, please, Fawn, please.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm having trouble hearing, so hopefully you can hear my remarks. My recommendation in how we go forward together is that we must all recognize that this is a very sacred space in time, and we are a chosen generation. When you look at all of the challenges confronting this generation, they're all apocalyptic, whether they're dealing with a global pandemic, dealing with the risks of climate change, and the social and racial injustice and hatred that is being leveled across this country. President Biden calls these the cascading crises of our time. And everybody knows in this country and everybody knows around this world that our communities are disproportionately impacted by these apocalyptic challenges. And as we individually and collectively confront these challenges, we are demonstrating that while these are mere symptoms of a much deeper imbalance, these imbalances didn't begin in 2020. They didn't even begin a lifetime ago. They began centuries ago. And through our ability to confront these challenges, we are a chosen generation. We are that generation that's chosen to draw a line in the sand, to directly address these issues and demonstrate through the very powerful narrative that we have that while we are at the receiving end and disproportionately impacted by these horrific challenges of our times, we have it within us, all of us, individually and collectively. We must not squander this opportunity. We must recognize that our narrative is a very powerful example of how we can come together. And the last thing I would just
Fawn, you're freezing up, so I'm going to turn to Susie for 1 minute.
point out is creating space for this of our time have been where young people have been given points of entry and opportunity to directly participate in their vision for a brighter future. Siakwa, thank you.
Great, thank you, Fawn. Susie, can I go to you?
Sure. I guess if I were to sort of think about some closing remarks, now more than ever, given the impacts of what we like to call the triple pandemics of the COVID-19 virus, the economic recession, and racism, it's critical for our communities to be intentional about working together to advance policy solutions to help our communities recover and build back better than before the pandemic. The civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the movement to stop Asian hate are just a few examples of how we are stronger together and can do so much to advance social and economic change. We now have a Congress and a White House that are aligned in their intent to advance racial equity throughout all public policies. And so now we have the opportunity to meet this moment. So I just want to thank APACS for hosting this important conversation and really look forward to working with each of you to ensure that America keeps its promise of freedom, justice, and opportunity for all.
Susie, thank you. Becky, can I go to you? Let's see if the mic works.
Is this better?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I think I just would say in closing, if we're looking at legislation that has worked, and if we're looking at what can happen at the local level, it is really important to note, for example, when I talk about the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, I'm also talking about the Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer No Hate Act. The reason that's important is that was an act that was included because of the advocacy of Asian American organizations. And that act was created to address the fact that time and time again in local communities, hate crimes are not being counted. They're not being counted by when victims are Arab American. They're not being counted when the victims are African American and when they're Asian American. And so one of the things I think is important that we can all hold on to is that it is because of advocates at the local level that act was included. It is because of advocates at the local level that we recognize that we have to make sure that the data that we have available allows us to hold everyone accountable. So thank you. And I am much more hopeful after this conversation and really appreciate the opportunity to join this. Thank you.
Becky, thank you. Let me go to Clarissa.
I was so inspired by Fawn's words. As others have said, the disproportionate impact of COVID in communities of color, ranging from health to economic to even hate crimes, are evidentiary proof of the consequences of systemic racism. And they really bring about a crisp opportunity and moment of action. The steps we take to model the behavior we want to see, to address colorism and bias within our own communities, as well as building our own and our joint power, will propel us as a driver to build an accurate narrative helping it take hold with the broader American public, and doing the work to make it a reality. And that brings me to doing and action. The majority of people are concerned, but are not sure what they can do about it. So let's be creative and provide action, small and big, the points of entry that Fawn was talking about. And so that tells us there are fundamental core issues to resolve with the original sense of racism and the structures that abet it. And that our nation has become more diverse. Also, quite a bit of catching up to do to ensure that our country is ready, willing, and able to govern equitably and fairly in an increasingly diverse society. And all of our communities are powerful players and agents in making sure that we can do so.
Clarissa, thank you. And Juliet, the last minute to you, please.
Great, thank you. Just incredibly grateful. So for our country writ large, this is a watershed moment. This whole last year has been a watershed moment. There has been so much pain and recognition of structural racism. And also the country is at a place where, in my opinion, never before have we locally, with more voices, with more community voices, centered Black lives, raised the critical urgency need to tackle structural racism. And of course, for the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we have not seen this level of daily attacks against our elders, our children. So with all of that, I want to ask us to double down, to have a more hopeful outlook going forward. We need to continue to amplify our voices and our generational voices. I think particularly as communities of color and immigrant communities, we have the power of multi-generational voices to bring forward. Number two, I want to ask and double down on those private and public sector partnerships. Nobody can do this alone, with government, with community, but also our private sector partners. And then number three, I am really, really eager to see what that new American narrative is going to look like going forward as a result of our collective voices. And again, just want to extend our thanks to the audience and all of my wise partners on this call for this incredible dialogue.
Well, Juliet, thank you. And thank you to the panel. I wish we had more time, but we don't. And I want to thank you all. You've been terrific. Hope we can meet again, maybe in person, which would be great. We're going to take a 30-minute break, I've been told, before the next panel begins. So thank you for joining us. And again, my thanks to Apex for inviting us all here for a lovely conversation. Thank you again. Good afternoon.
Thank you.